and that this meeting is making sense. So at the end of the last session, somebody, and I forgot who it was, asked the question, how does all of this apply to preaching? So we've done a lot of work. We've talked about various things. We've talked about how you read stories. We've talked about plot. We've talked about character. And then the question is, how does all of this apply to preaching? And this session today is really where everything begins to come together. So everything you've learned should now begin to move towards a sermon. So today is very simple in terms of what we're going to do. One, we're probably going to spend quite a bit of time on the homework that you had to do. So I hope you've done it because that's really important. And it's going to be at the beginning of our session and also the end of our session. And in the middle, we're really going to talk about what's been known as the big idea or the SNDT or the homiletical thought. And we're just going to bring these things together. And hopefully by the end of this session, you will be a lot clearer on how you're moving from exegesis to now forming a sermon. So, as we begin, you had two sets of homework last time. One, which was for everybody, and then the second part was if you were feeling really brave. And I just want to check, maybe by a show of virtual hands, who actually got around to doing the homework? Okay, I've got at least 4 people who got around to doing it. Okay, so what we're going, so the first homework, and this, and I apologize, well, I don't apologize for it taking a while because it should have taken a while. But this first homework was based on, let me get down on the screen, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, and you were to read it in at least 3 different versions. And then your responsibility was to identify all the characters in the story. And then for each character, you were to identify and list with the verses as a reference, any direct description you had, any actions that got talked about, any names, any designation, any dialogue. And then at the very end, you were to list any insights you've gained generally about this passage through the process. So what I want to do literally is just go through this and just get some feedback from you all on how it went and on what you did. So let me just check how this is going to work. Yeah, let's do this. So first off, Mark 5, 1 to 20. Clive and Curtis, did you have a question or is your hand still raised from the? Okay.
No, it was raised inadvertently.
Okay, no problem. And the same for you? Okay, great. So first off, Mark 5, 1 to 20, who are the characters in this story? Who are the characters in Mark chapter 5, 1 to 20?
Characters are Jesus, number 1,
Mhm.
and the man with the evil spirit, the legion,
Okay.
is the main character.
Thank you for those 2, Norma. What
Yes.
I do want to ask people to do is if you raise your hand and then I'll come to you. So then I'll go to Clive and then Lordina.
So there are some other characters as well. There are those that accompanied Jesus across the lake, his disciples and those that were in the little ship, as they mentioned in the previous chapter. There are the people that are looking after the swine. And then there are the people that are in the country, that country, the Gadarenes. And then lastly, the people in the Capilis.
Okay.
His friends in the Capilis.
Yeah. Calvin, anything to add to that or? Okay, you were on mute, Calvin. So I'm assuming everything's okay and we've covered the characters. Rudo?
Yes, there is also the many because when this man with an evil spirit was asked what his name was, he said, "I'm Legion, for we are many." So there is many, and then there is also like somebody said, the people that were accompanying Jesus. But then there is also the friends of this person, because it's mentioned that when he goes home, he shouldn't tell the friends.
Okay.
Go home. Oh, yes, he should go home to his friends, and then he should tell them, what great things, the Lord had done for him. So there's also the friends. Yeah.
Thank you. Michael, very quickly before we move on. Oh, sorry, Micho, sorry, not Michael.
There are people who we have a hint that they would tie this man in chains.
Okay, yes. Yeah, so there are others as well. So here is what I got on characters. I had the man with the unclean spirit, I had Jesus, I had the swineherds, the people of the Gerasenes. And so this is a really interesting one, because I couldn't decide whether I wanted Legion to be a separate character or the same as the man. And the reason that I listed it as a separate character is because I think Legion has its own characteristics. So in this story, it is possible for Legion to be separate from this man. So when it's in the man's in trouble. When it moves out of the man, the swine are in trouble.
I also had the Legion as a character as well, and the swines.
Okay. Yeah.
I also listed those two as characters in the entire story, because the Legion separated himself, identified himself actually, and took over the conversation.
Yeah. So you've got a separate one from the man there. Okay. So in this story, did you see any direct description? And again, if you can raise your hands and then I'll come to you. Was there any direct description of any characters? Yep, Calvin? You're still muted.
Sorry, I was spoken previously with it muted. Yes, the man with the unclean spirit, there's quite a bit of description given about him in verses 2 to 5 and also in verses 15. And he was the only one I sort of find in the narrative that had an actual direct description.
Yeah, okay. So I would agree. Again, let's see if I think maybe, yeah, originally, yeah. Really, the only direct description I had was the man with the unclean spirit, that he lived among the tombs, and basically he was unrestrainable. So, and for nobody else in the story did I really have that much direct description. Jacob.
The number of the swine, 2,000 head.
Yeah. Okay. That also works, and yeah, that's definitely can be included. YL.
I also had Jesus being described as the Son of God by the unclean spirits.
Yeah, Son of the Most.
And the pigs who were many, a large herd.
Yes. So that's important. So direct description. So there's direct description and there's also designations. So I had Jesus being described as Son of the Most High God as a designation.
Oh, okay.
Under number 4. But yeah, that can also work. So moving forward, like the next thing then we were looking at was actions. What actions do people do in this story? And so there's a lot of different actions. Firstly, what are the man with the unclean spirits actions? Curtis.
Came to Jesus and begged him, well, he asked Jesus the question, what he would do to him, and he begged him not to, in verse, hold on, lost writing, but he asked him not to cast him out of the area. So that was a direct action, begging Jesus not to cast him out.
Okay.
Or to torture him.
Okay, so that could be the direct action of either the man with the unclean spirit or Legion. Anything else that anyone had in terms of direct action? Jacob.
This one, what I'm going to mention is it's past continuous and present continuous too. So he lived among the tombs. He wrenched the chains apart and broke the shackles in pieces and was always crying out and cutting himself with stones.
Okay, yep. Mollet, thank you very much, Jacob. Anything else, Mollet, that this man did?
I'll continue from Jacob. Ran to Jesus, worshipped him, begged Jesus, at the end sat at the feet of Jesus and clothed.
Okay, thank you very much, Mollet. Clive?
So I got here in verse 2 that when Jesus arrived on the other side, that the man, it says, came immediately out of the tombs and met him.
Okay.
And also that in verse 13, the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea. That's quite descriptive, and that they were choked in the sea, and that the sheep herders fled when they saw what happened to the swine.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So what I have, the man with the unclean spirit, he meets Jesus as soon as Jesus stepped out of the boat. He wrenches shackles and breaks chains and pieces. Now that was interesting because I think, like Jacob was saying, it's past continuous and present continuous. So you're being told what's happening in the past, but it's also his action. So sometimes you double stuff up. So that could be direct description, or it could be his actions. I put it down as both, just so that you get it. Verse 5, night and day he's howling and bruising himself with stones. Verse 6, he runs and bows down before Jesus. Verse 7, he shouts at the top of his voice. Verse 9, he converses with Jesus. Verse 15, he sits before Jesus clothed and in his right mind. And verse 18, he begs Jesus that he might go with him. Now, I'm missing the conversation because I treated the man and Legion as two separate characters. Frederica.
Well, he also proclaimed when Jesus told him to share what he had done, he proclaimed.
That's true.
Yeah, so I just saw that as the direct action of.
So that's also one of his actions that I missed there, that he went out and he began to proclaim what Jesus had done for him. And that's actually a really important one. Okay. Again, I don't want to spend too long on this, so I'll show you. In fact, if you tell me what are some of Jesus's actions? Anybody in this passage? What are some of Jesus's actions?
He got out of the boat, first of all.
Yeah.
And he got into the boat. So that's, in terms of action, that's what I've seen.
Okay, thank you, Federico. YL?
He commanded the, I heard that he commanded the spirit to come out of the man. And he asked the spirits, what is your name? And he gave permission to the spirits to enter the swine. And then, as the previous person said, then he told the man to go and preach. And then, as the previous speaker said, he came out of the boat and he went back into the boat.
Okay, and Sita?
I'd just like to add, he also conversed, or was rather confronted by the people of the town. They wanted him to leave their town because of what they had witnessed. They were quite disturbed by it. So then he left.
Okay, so he left. So Jesus being confronted, what I would say, isn't his action, it's the action of someone else, but his action is to leave.
Yeah, but he also spoke to them as well, didn't he? Yeah.
Yes. So, but remember, there's kind of, well, actually, does he speak to them?
Or he listens to them.
Yes, and
listens to them.
This is where we have to just read these stories closely, because sometimes we can assume stuff which isn't in the story. But no, Sita, thank you for that very good point.
Thank you.
So Jesus, what I have as action, steps out of the boat, speaks to the demoniac, gives Legion permission to go into the pigs. He leaves the area at the people's request. and he refuses the ex-demoniac's request to come with him. That's another big thing. And then I'll just go through the rest because I also want to look at, oh, Des? Yeah, Des?
What about receiving the worship of the demoniac?
Is that an action? Because I think in that Jesus is actually quite passive. He doesn't, like, the demoniac comes and bows down before him, and so I wouldn't describe that necessarily as an action for Jesus, but I understand what you're meaning. And so some of these things are like hard to quantify. Norma? Norma, are you there?
Jesus showed authority over the spiritual world by demanding that spirit to leave him. Okay, no one else could, but he did.
Yep.
And then he told the man, go and tell others, your friends, get out, go and tell others about it. He wanted to go with him, and he said, no, go and tell others, your friends. Yeah.
So that's true. What I would say though, because we've not got to words yet, because we're keeping actions and what people say separate. And the reason for doing this is really just to help you to read the story a lot more slowly. To slow down, to read it closely, to notice what's going on and what's not going on. Okay, I'm going to move forward and just go through some of these as well. So names, there was nothing really significant about any names that I had, and that's really names in translation, and you'll see it a bit in the other story to make a bit more sense. Designations, so the man, oh, Norma, and then Clive.
Sorry, it's a mistake.
Okay, Clive.
Yeah, I mean, the name Legion is significant because it's identified as for we are many.
Yes, yes, but when like we're talking about names, it's really names that you would have to know the meaning for them to be significant. So because you're told that, like Legion isn't significant because you know that it means for we are many. But
okay.
That's a good point. So designations, man with unclean spirit, he's described as a man out of the tomb with an unclean spirit. He's described as a demoniac, and he's described as the man in verse 18. Jesus, Son of the Most High God in verse 7, and that's pretty much it. Now, sometimes with these stories, you're not always going to get much on names and designations, but if you do, it is important. So it is important that when this man comes out, he identifies Jesus as Son of the Most High God, because it tells you something about the story. Finally, dialogue. Now, again, this is really interesting because a lot of the time in these stories, we can almost believe people say more than they actually say. So, hold on, go back. The man with the unclean spirit says, and really this is the only thing he is quoted as saying in the passage. What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. And again, that's because I'm splitting up the man and Legion. But in terms of a direct quote from him, that's the only thing he says in the passage. Jesus, I have come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And then verse 19, he says, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown on you. And then finally, Legion, my name is Legion, for we are many. Send us into the swine, let us enter them. And that's really the only dialogue. Now, you've got some other reported speech, but in terms of actual dialogue, I think that is it for the story. Rudo.
Yeah. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Jesus also asked this man in verse 9. He said, "What is your name?"
Okay. Yes. Yeah. He did. He did. He did also ask what is his name. Anything else from anybody?
Oh yes. So verse 19. Sorry. Jesus sort of said something to the cured demonic man. So verse 19. So I had that as a bit of a bit of direct speech.
Yeah, that's in there as well. So once you've done all that, and again, the purpose of doing all that isn't to get you to know the passage. Really, the next question is, and I didn't put anything down on this because I wanted to hear what you all thought. What insights did you gain about this passage through doing that process? So what things did you realize about this passage and story that you didn't know before through doing this process? Or did no one realize anything? Wael? And then Ruba.
Yes, what I realized is, what I thought I realized is that Jesus had no dialogue with the people. He just listened to them because they kept telling him, leave the town, do this, do that. The other thing is that the demons actually recognized Jesus, and that the man was self-harming, which is a very common thing nowadays with people who are having mental problems, because he constantly cut himself with stones. So it's you know, a significant part of mental health. And then I just thought, after seeing such a fantastic miracle by Jesus, how could they possibly ask him to leave rather than begging him to stay and continue, you know, doing things that were good? You know, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ruda?
Yes, where Jesus says, what is your name? You know, before when I was telling even the children this story, I would go straight to say he was legion, and because there were many of them. And then just going into the dialogues and seeing that it was Jesus who asked him, who prompted this question, what is it? And in verse 8, it actually said, come out of the man, unclean spirit. So it's like a highlight of it shows, you know, this, the severity of the problem. There were many of them. It wasn't just you know, a small little thing. There were many. So Jesus prompted, and it brings out the answer. And just looking at the dialogue, you see how big this problem was. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Wael, if you put your hand down, just so that I can see clearly.
Oh, sorry.
And also Ruda. So once you've spoken, please don't forget to take your hand down. And Barbara?
Yes, I think in verse 12, I wanted to say, it scared me that all the devils sought him, saying, send us into the swine that we may enter into them. This is very scary. If you, I just thought, if you live a life without prayer, maybe demons next door to you, from your neighbors, might come into your house, in your workplace, all over the place. It's also good to pray from your workplace, your neighbors, your families, your brothers and sisters. It's a whole life of prayer that we have to be confined to, in case somehow demons might be, they might ask for permission to come into my house. If it's dirty, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Micho?
I saw the glimpse into the great controversy. We are initially looking at a man who is troubled, but Jesus allows us a window into what exactly is happening. That this man's life has been taken control by the spiritual world, which often we are not able to identify, like my sister identified earlier. When people are self-harming and are doing all manner of self-destroying behaviors, we see them as doing this to themselves. We don't realize that there is a power that is behind all this harm and destruction. And this passage brings this openly. But again, our powerlessness when dealing with the spiritual world, so that, yes, they bind him with chains and he breaks them. powerless. But when Jesus comes, it is by his word that he makes it right.
Okay.
Divine power. The same Emmanuel who conquered the spiritual world at the conception of sin in heaven is seen in this scene, again defeating the devil from this man, freeing him so that he can be a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Okay, thank you very much. Malusi, Sita, Jacob, Norma, Stan, and Elder Riley. That's it. So please just keep your comments brief because we still have to do the other story and there's a lot to do today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Washing machine is running here, so I hope it's not making too much noise for anyone.
No, we can't hear
it. The thing that really struck me is we do often talk about how transformative an encounter with Jesus is. But I also really found that this passage highlighted, that's Mark 5, highlighted for me the fact that the impact of encountering Jesus could either be positive or negative.
Okay.
Because when I look at the contrast between the demoniac who was healed and the city dwellers and country dwellers, they came and asked Jesus, please leave, go away. But this man wanted to be with Jesus.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Sita?
I just wanted to kind of ask for clarification. So is there really a correlation with between somebody who's got mental health issues and somebody who's demonically suppressed? Are these not two different things?
Okay.
And also the term legion as well, which is meaning, you know, we are of many. This is something that, you know, the Romans went on to use quite significantly, like the legions, and it had a very military connotation around it. So I just wanted to add that.
So I will come back to your question at the end, but thank you for your comment because it's an important question. Jacob?
A few things. The first one is that when the demoniac bows before Christ and addresses him in his fullest designations, it was a commonly understood practice in those days to address a person by their fullest names in the hope of exercising some power over them.
Okay, yeah.
Now the demon-possessed men spoke these names in the hope of keeping Jesus from driving them out. But of course, we know that this encounter was hopeless. However, we also know that the encounter instead shows us that all authority bows down to the highest authority of the Lord, and which is what happened in this case. After begging Jesus not to, after addressing Jesus by his fullest designations, that didn't work, and therefore the devil bowed down before Christ.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Norma Thomas? Norma?
Yes, I was just thinking that, you know, no one could subdue this man. He was stronger than anyone else, and therefore he was free to roam and cause, you know, turmoil. Overseas people have tried many times to bind him, but he couldn't. You know, he got the strength like Simpson. Only thing, Simpson's strength came from the Lord. This man's strength came from the demon. And no one thing to ask God for help. But he came out and asked him for help, because a lot of us sometimes do not ask God to help us. And we try to use our own strength when it doesn't work.
Okay.
But yeah.
Thank you for your point, Noah. My only question would be, and this is more of a rhetorical question, but to think about, where in the passage does it say that nobody asked God for help? Because again, when we read these stories, we have to be really careful that we don't assume things or read them into the stories. So, if you look in the passage, there is nowhere that it says no one asked God for help. But what it does say is that they were unable to control him. Stan, Elder Riley, and then Dumasani, and then I need to move on. You're muted, Stan.
Yes, that's better, I think. I thought I'd just cheer people up with my background there. One of the insights I saw was the use of a boat. Jesus's ministry. We know Jesus used a boat to preach from. He used a boat to find solitude from people, and he also used the boat, obviously, in this example as well. And I think sometimes there's parallel with Jesus' use of a boat here, also with Noah's Ark, and I can see some comparisons there. That boat is part of Jesus' ministry.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Elder Riley.
Good day, everyone. Someone expressed earlier the serious nature of the problem that faced this demoniac man. And when I looked up the definition for legion, it says a division of 3,000 to 600 men. My thoughts were, what was it that brought about or caused this man to be possessed by so many demons? What was his lifestyle? That was my thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you. And finally, Dumasani.
Good morning, everybody. Mine is more of a question which needs a clarification, because there are two, two conversations. The first one between Christ and the men, and the Christ and the demons. Yeah, I think that it should be clarified what was said to the men and what was said to the demons, because we may end up confusing, thinking everything was said to the men or everything was said to the demon.
Yeah, so I would say, just to clarify quickly, Jesus' first conversation is with the demons, and his second conversation is with the man. And that's the simplest way to do it. Now, just to go back to Cedar's question, because it is a very delicate one, this idea of demon possession and mental health issues. Now, some people would say a lot of what is read as demon possession in the New Testament, we would describe as mental health issues. And there may be a correlation, because when it comes to demon possession or mental health issues, what we clearly know is that there is something that is wrong. And sometimes we may not be able to, sometimes we might not be able to decipher exactly what the cause is or what the root is, but what we do know is that something is wrong. And what this story tells us is that whether it is mental health issues or whether it is demon possession, we serve a God who can do something about it. And so while it's a delicate issue, and what I wouldn't want you to do is to begin to go around to people and start saying their mental health issues mean that they're demon possessed. That's not necessarily true. I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, and God will give you insight into what's going on. Mitchell, I'm not taking any more comments just because I need to get through, and this was only the first story. But so the other thing that I would want to say is your comments were good, but what we have to try not to do is read into the story from other parts. Because part of preaching stories is about taking the story at its face value and working out what is the message of the story. And so I want to go very briefly, and I'm only going to take 3 answers. So the first 3 people, but please keep them short. Very briefly back to YL's question, because I think YL's question for me is central to this story, and it gives you insight into what is going on. And YL's question was, why is it that the people asked Jesus to leave after he's done something so good for them? Why do they ask Jesus to leave after he's done something so good for them? And based on everything you've done with this story, you should have some inkling of an answer to that question, if you're thinking about the story and putting it all together. Clive.
The passage tells us that they were afraid.
Okay. But why are they afraid when he's done something so good for them? What are they afraid of?
They clearly lack faith in Jesus.
Okay, so they clearly lack faith in Jesus. I think what you say is true. I think it's a more negative way of describing it, but yeah. And Baba, Millet, and if it's only me, okay, I've got enough 6 hands, and I only want to 3. So I'm only gonna take and Baba and then Millet, and then I'll have to move on as well.
I think they sent him away because he was such an expense in terms of he caused an economic loss.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So some people went for the economic loss. Okay. Millet, finally.
Same response.
Economic loss. Okay. So that's very interesting. I would go a slightly different direction because you've got to think. So are they? So it describes the people as being afraid, like Clive was saying, when Jesus comes and they beg him to leave. Now, thinking about the story and what happened in the story and thinking about it in a story form, could the people control the demon-possessed man? Yes or no?
No.
No,
They
they
couldn't.
couldn't. So
No,
here
they
you
were
have
afraid.
here you have a situation where you can't control the demon-possessed man at all, and he's been running riot. Then this other person turns up who you know nothing about, and he's got this demon-possessed man who you couldn't control at all, begging for mercy. And he heals him and he fixes him completely. I think part of the problem and part of the issue for the people is if they couldn't control the demon-possessed man, they were scared of having Jesus around. So yes, it could be economic, but I think it's deeper. The demon-possessed man had been dominating them basically. Now Jesus turns up and he controls the demon-possessed man. They don't want a problem that big. And so they ask him to leave. Yes, the pigs jumped off the cliff and all that kind of stuff, but Jesus is more dangerous than this demon-possessed man. And the reason I argue that is the other thing about the story, which I hope you notice, is that there is only one request in the whole story that Jesus turns down. So what's really interesting is that when the legion asked him to send them into the pig, Jesus says, yes, you can go. When the people ask him to leave, Jesus says, yes. Just give me a second, please. Just a second. Okay, I'm back now. So when the demon-possessed man, when the legion asked Jesus to go into the pigs, he says, yes. When the people ask Jesus to leave, he obliges. When the demon-possessed man asks Jesus if he can come with him, Jesus says no. And it is so ironic that the very thing you would think that Jesus would want, he says no to. And the reason why Jesus says no is because he understands what's going on with these people. They don't know who he is. They don't know what he's like. So it's necessary that the demon-possessed man stays so he can talk to the people about what Jesus is like. So if and when Jesus comes back, and he does come back, that the people will be more receptive to him. And I think that's the real insight of the story. That the reason Jesus tells the demon-possessed man or the ex-demon-possessed man to stay is because what he's actually saying is these people don't know what kind of power I have, and that it's actually for their benefit, not for their heart. You have to stay and talk about who I am so that these people will know that when I come back, yeah, they will understand me properly. Mark, and then we're going to move on. Mark? Yeah, Mark, I can't hear you at all. I don't know what happened there. Sita?
Thank you, Pastor Holden. So I just wanted to add on to what you just said. So this was also a spontaneous act that Jesus committed. So he came off the boat, and he was confronted by this man who was demon possessed, but also the people were afraid. And it was uncommon for the Jewish people to leave people, you know, in the state that they were in, whether they had leprosy or some kind of other disease, as we've seen the woman with the blood issue as well. So they were quite happy to leave this man and basically let him rot because he's in shackles, and that was the only way they can control him. So they didn't know how either to deal with this individual. Yeah. And so when Jesus came, and you know, in a blink of an eyelid, he's healed and he's sitting at his feet and talking to him. So this was another thing that they were shocked about. It wasn't common for them to see such healing taking place. So they were afraid, you know, who is this person? Is he a demon in himself, for example, or some kind of an entity? Hence why they asked him to leave the town.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, thank you very much. So, Mother, I'm going to have to move on just because I want to get through this. So I'm going to go through very quickly what I had for the Genesis story. We're going to come back to it, but just due to time, I want to make sure we get through because there is still a lot to do and focus on today. So Genesis 20, exactly the same thing. Direct description, actions, names, designation, dialogue. Characters I had in Genesis 20, Abraham, Sarah, Abimelech, God, and the servants. So not a huge amount of characters, but those are the characters. And then they move from round characters to flat characters. Actions. Abraham, he journeys towards the Negev, he lives between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourns at Gerar. He also in verse 2 tells people that Sarah is his sister. In verse 11, he talks with Abimelech. And in verse 17, he prays to God for Abimelech. Actions for Sarah, interestingly, I didn't have any. There isn't anything really that Sarah does. She has some reported speech, but there is no action for Sarah in the story. In this story, Sarah is really acted upon. For Abimelech, he takes Sarah. In verse 5, he talks with God. In verse 8, he calls all his servants and tells them what has happened. Verse 9 and 10, he calls Abraham and speaks with him. Verse 14, he gives Abraham sheep, oxen, male and female slaves. Verse 17, he tells Abraham to settle wherever he wants. And verse 18, he tells Sarah that she's exonerated. God, he comes to Abimelech in a dream. He heals Abimelech and his wife and female slaves because he had closed fast the wounds of Abimelech's house. That's really actions. Names. Abraham's name means father of nations. Sarah obviously had her name changed because she's going to be the mother of nations. Abimelech's name means my father is king. Maybe in the story, Abraham's name is only really significant, and we'll probably come back to that at the end of the session. But these are just interesting things to know. Designation. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. In verse 7, Abraham is called by God a prophet. And verse 5, he's described as a brother by Sarah. Sarah, interestingly, is described as Abraham's wife in verses 2, 7, 11, 12, and 14. Sorry, I missed my comma there. And then she's described as his sister in verses 2 and verse 5. And what's interesting just on that, so designations are important, but especially with Sarah in this story, it's important who uses those designations. So, as far as I can remember, Sarah is only described as Abraham's sister in this story by Abraham in verse 2 and Abraham in verse 5, and then again when he's talking to Abimelech later. But it's only Abraham who describes Sarah as his sister. God doesn't describe Sarah as his sister, and neither does the narrator. For both God and the narrator, it's his wife. And then finally, dialogue. In verse 2, Abraham says, she is my sister. Verse 11, he says, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Verse 12, Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. Verse 13, and when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother. For Sarah, the only dialogue, and it isn't even real dialogue, but it's a reported dialogue by Abimelech, that she said to him, he is my brother. Abimelech's dialogue, he says to God in verse 4 and 5, Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands. Verse 9, what have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that ought not to be done. Verse 10, what were you thinking of that you did this thing? Verse 15, my land is before you, settle where it pleases you. Verse 16, look, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is your exoneration before all who are with you. You're completely vindicated. Actually, I guess Abimelech describes Abraham as Sarah's brother, but like I said before, no one else refers to Sarah as Abraham's sister apart from Abraham. And then God, he says, you're about to die for the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Verse 6, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against her, therefore I did not let you touch her. And then verse 7, now then return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that are yours. I wanted to get through this because I guess the most interesting part for me, hearing from you now, is, let's see, no, not that I've got my last slide, but the question is, what were some of the things you learned about this passage from going through this book? Hopefully someone made it to Genesis chapter 20 to do this as well. Yeah, Calvin.
That Abraham, I think, he knew what he was doing was being economic with the truth. He could have gone on to explain to Abimelech, maybe half sisters, but really we're married, and the remainder of the narrative may not have happened, but it probably sort of shows, despite our good intentions or maybe being economic with the truth, God is still able to use us to accomplish his will if we allow him to work through us.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much. Wayo?
Well, I see here that God is a merciful God, because he protected Abimelech, because he knew Abimelech was innocent.
Mm-hmm.
So he said himself that I prevented you from touching her.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing I found in this passage is that Abimelech himself is an honorable man in all that he said to Abraham. And then in the end, he respected women because he recognized that Sarah had been tarnished in the eyes of everyone. To exonerate her, he actually said it, I'm going to give you this amount of money so that everyone will know that you're an honorable woman. I had nothing to do with you. As you came to me pure, and I'm giving you back pure. So I think Abimelech is a man of integrity.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to that. Mitchell?
We often associate faith with courage, but on this occasion, we see Abraham as fearful. He is a scared man. His attempt to deceive appears to derive from this state of fear and anxiety, what will happen to him.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Barbara?
I like verse 2. Verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night. You know, this one touched me because before we know, God is fighting our battles. He is there. He says, just pray in faith and go to sleep, and God will do the rest. So sometimes the battle is in the Lord's hands, so we should relax. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Malusi?
I think it's a similar point to what others have made, but with a slightly different slant, because I see God's grace being shown to Abraham in spite of himself. God protected his wife and him from whatever he was afraid of, but God also protected Abimelech in spite of himself, because Abimelech was greedy. He had a whole harem of wives and women, but as soon as he sees Abraham's wife, he wants her for himself. But again, God protected him.
Okay.
And finally, I think the other thing that perhaps I haven't heard from others is, in fact, maybe different from what someone has said. To me, women here are just used as objects because they have no voice. Men are speaking for them and saying, we will do this, we will do this. But the female servants, Sarah, no one says a word, and perhaps the male servants as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think, Lucy, that's an important point, and I feel that's something you can only get when you're reading the story closely. It's only when you read the story closely that you realize that Sarah doesn't do anything and Sarah doesn't say anything, and all that happens in this story is that she is acted upon by men, basically. And it's just a really interesting point, but something you'll only get if you're willing to do these close readings. Jacob, as our last comment, then I've got two questions for everybody.
Yeah, so I found something very curious. In verse 3, it says, the text says, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, thou art a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. Nothing else is said by God in this regard, except for verse 6, of course. But at the end, in verse 18, it says, for the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. The question that comes up now is, what was the length of time that Abraham sojourned in this land of Gerar? And secondly, what does the phrase "thou art but a dead man" mean in relation to the closing up of the wombs, if at all there's a connection there? And what are the implications of the absence of a direct report on the state of these women, where the things happen, and where we are given a report of the remedy at the end?
Okay, well, that's very good point and very interesting questions, and I appreciate your close reading of the text. What I would say is, and we're going to come back to it. I'm not sure how central those things are, but they are very, very keen insights. Marcus, and then Sita, and then that's it. And I want to ask my two questions. We'll have a break. Oh, Sita?
There's something that
Okay. Sorry. Go, Marcus.
Yeah, there's something that I couldn't understand in this text. I think there are two parties here, main actors, I would say. There's Abraham and Abimelech. And in this story, one of them is innocent, one is in the wrong. Abraham is in the wrong in this story. And instead, God punishes, from the look of things, the innocent party. And the guilty party goes scot-free. I just couldn't understand why is that in this story?
Yeah, and I think this is the central thing, especially when we're reading the story from our perspective, that it really hangs on. Not only does God punish the innocent party. But God has the temerity to describe Abraham as a prophet and say to Abimelech, even though you've done nothing wrong, you've got to get this man who got you into this situation in the first place and cost you your life to pray for you. And unless he prays for you, I'm not going to heal you. And it sounds crazy. I think for like most of us, we would find it offensive if we found ourselves in Abimelech's situation. That the person who got us in trouble and lied about us and messed things up for us, God is now saying, I'm not going to help you unless you go to them. Sita?
I just wanted to ask Pastor Holden, it's a kind of a question and an observation. So do you think the reason why God interceded as well in this situation was because he had a bigger plan for Abraham and Sarah? So, in order to bring his plans into fruition, he had to intercede with Abimelech and Sarah.
Yeah, you know what, Sita? I think you're exactly right, and that's something we're going to look at later when we come back to the story. But no, I think you're spot on.
Thank you.
Micho, finally. Micho? Okay.
I have a slight understanding of the guilty and the innocent between the two men. A brother referenced this earlier, that Abimelech has a whole horde of women in his household, so that there was literally no need apart from greed to see a new woman coming in the picture and then suddenly she is yours just because you can. So there is no innocence there if we are saying the man is punished innocent.
Okay.
The other layer to that question is, we all know even in the basic civil law that ignorance is not defense. He is committing adultery, hence God's approach to him is, you are a dead man for having a married woman. Yes, she might have come your place because you have been deceived by Abraham, but she is a married woman. So the element of guilt is in adultery. So I'm sure Abimelech connects to that charge without question. He does not see God as punishing him innocently. He acknowledges his sin fully, and he pays restitution even to the woman that might have been deceived by Abraham into this situation.
Okay, so that is very interesting. I think, Romita, I'm going to say I disagree. And why I disagree is, look at what Abimelech says in verse 4 and 5 and what God says to him in verse 6. So verse 4, Abimelech, it says, now Abimelech had not approached her. So he says, and this is what he says, Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. He then says, I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands. Now, remember how much we said that what people say is really important. So what we know about Abimelech is that Abimelech believes he is innocent and he acted in integrity. Now listen to what God says to him. Yes, I know, verse 6, that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. So I'm not sure that God blames Abimelech either. And I guess this leads to my last two questions. One, in this story, who is the better man, Abraham or Abimelech? And then secondly, who is closer to God, Abraham or Abimelech?
I think the one who's innocent, I can say, is Abimelech, and the one who's closer to God is Abraham.
Okay, that's very interesting. Ian, thank you, Becky.
I totally agree with my previous brother who made that comment. Abimelech is innocent, but Abraham is closer to God because for the simple reason that he is God's man. He is the man with whom God has made the covenant, regardless of his behavior. Regardless of Abraham's behavior, he's still God's man because God said earlier on in Genesis, I know him and he will command his house after him to be obedient to me. But I think, if I may suggest that the key to unlocking this is the chronology. And the reason I say that is because there are a few pointers within the whole text that point to the fact that the chronology is important to the interpretation, because in verse 1, it tells us that Abraham was there for a while when he stayed in Gerar. And as my brother pointed out previously, in verse 18, the Lord had closed every womb. So in order to do that, there must have been a transition of time to find out that the women were not getting pregnant. So in relation to chronology, I think the key to understanding what's happening here is that the writer has set up the story or has set the scene to say he's gone there, he's been there for a while, and whilst he was there, Abimelech took Sarah and put her into his harem. And she was in his harem for quite some time. And while she was in the harem for quite some time, he didn't touch her because he's got so many women and he's a man of business, he's doing other things. But while she was there for quite some time, the Lord started to afflict the people of Abimelech in that they could not have children. So the time element comes in here where things are happening, children are not coming, and so on. And it is after a transition of time, after the women are not getting pregnant, after God appears to Abimelech in a dream and says, look, this woman is a man's wife, and therefore, if you don't hand her back after her being in your harem for so long and not touching her, if you don't hand her back, I'm going to kill you. And although it's not expressly said, the implication is I've already been touching your people because of barrenness, but now I'm saying to you directly, release the woman or else I'm going to destroy you and your nation.
Okay, so that makes sense. What I would say though, the only thing I would say is yes, there is definitely barrenness, and God had closed fast wound. There may be a different reason that comes there in the story, because generally in the story, again, based on what people say and on what they do, this barrenness doesn't seem to be an issue for Abimelech. So it's not meant to. So if the story read from the beginning, Abimelech took Sarah, and then they discovered that no one was having children. And Abimelech was really worried and wondering why I can't produce any offspring. And then got it. Like, that's where the barrenness comes in. But I think because the barrenness comes in later, there may be a different purpose for it. But yeah, Norbert, Osvaldo, Norma, and then we're going to have a break.
Yeah. In spite Pastor, I would like to say on this occasion, Abimelech is the man of God. God is in the business of saving people, and Abraham was supposed to witness to Abimelech, but we see here, Abimelech is the one who has got a saving faith in what God said. Unlike Abraham, who knows God, but does not have a saving faith in God.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. No, but and that's an interesting point, because I guess others have said that Abraham is a man of God. Osvaldo, and then Norma.
Yeah, I think despite of the Abimelech being trapped from Abraham, but he was a man of integrity because he listened the advice of God, saying restore the woman because she's married, and then the man shall pray for you and you shall live.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And then Norma?
Yes, I think God promises to Abraham and Sarah to provide a natural born child was at risk, and God's action demonstrate both his faithfulness and his mercy. God, God afflicted Abimelech with an illness and closed out the womb of the woman in the household. God had a plan for Abraham, and it was under, that is the reason why he had to step in, because he didn't want Abimelech to give Sarah a child. It should be from Abraham. His plan with Abraham.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your comments and engagement. We're going to come back to the story towards the end as well. What I would like to say though is, one, I'd say 95% certain you have never heard anyone preach on this. But what I would also say is this is actually one of my favorite passages and favorite stories in the Bible, because I think it says a lot of important and interesting things which we're going to get to, and some of you haven't got to already as we move through. But I didn't mean to take that long with the homework, but we can still make it work. If we take maybe like a 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back and we'll continue with that next section. Wait, our recording has started, so we can continue. So this lecture is called The Big Idea. And as we go through, hopefully it will make hopefully it will make sense why we spent so much time going through the homework, because like I said, we're going to come back to it and deal with it again. So the big idea, and this is really now moving from what we've done in exegesis and thinking about exegesis, and there's some other parts of exegesis we can talk about, and we probably will in the next couple of weeks just to tidy a few things up, and indirectly maybe in this session. But now you've done your exegesis, how do you move towards a sermon? And this is one of the principles that is absolutely key. Whether you're preaching narrative sermons or topical, like whatever sermon you are preaching, what I'm going to share with you now should be a principle you stick by and stick with all the time. Because I think it's one of the reasons why our preaching isn't as good as it could be. And that's across the board. So let me move forward. And it's just these two statements. It's okay. Every sermon should have a central idea, one main thing you are trying to communicate. And secondly, you should be able to distill your message down to a single idea or a single sentence. So every sermon should have a central idea, one main thing you are trying to communicate, and then two, you should be able to distill your message down to a single idea. And that idea really should be communicated in your sermon. So to put it another way, I don't know how many times you've been to church services or been talking with someone later, and they've asked you, what was the sermon about? And your response has been, well, they talked about this, and they talked about this, and this was an interesting thing they said. Or sometimes your response may have been, I can't tell you. I can't tell you what I can tell you things they mentioned, but I can't tell you what the sermon was about. And this is one of the principles of communication, that when it comes to preaching and when it comes to sharing messages, you need to have a central idea. When you stand to preach, there should be one main thing you are trying to communicate. Now, that may be difficult because you may find a lot of things interesting, but it's about going through these texts like Mark 5:1-20 and trying to work out, in general, what is the message of the text? What is the major thing that this story or this passage is trying to communicate? Because for the most part, there is one major thing it's trying to communicate. And we have to avoid picking things from here that we find interesting or picking things from here that we're finding interesting, and try to communicate the story or the idea as one thing. And then secondly, and most important, well, not most importantly, but like an outflow of this is you should be able to distill that thing you're trying to communicate down to a single sentence or at most 2 sentences. A single sentence would be great because then you know your message. There's a statement which I'm sure many of you have heard from your lay preaching training before, or just generally when it comes to preaching. And it goes something like this. It says, If there is a mist in the pulpit, there will be a fog in the pew. And basically, I'll say it again, if there is a mist in the pulpit, then there will be a fog in the pew. And what that means is if you are unclear about what you're saying and what you're trying to communicate, then your listeners are going to be even more unclear, because they don't have the benefit of all your study and everything you've been thinking about. You were just communicating to them, and if you're not communicating your point, or if you're not clear on what you're trying to say, then it makes it even harder for your listeners to understand. An easy illustration, just to help people get it, is this idea of you can be in conversation with somebody and listening to them talk for a while, and you begin to think, just get to the point. What are you trying to say? Like, I don't need to know that you woke up at 6 a.m. in the morning and that your hot water wasn't working if what you're trying to ask me is for a lift to work. Like, get to the point. And that's the really important thing then, that when it comes to communication. Too often what can happen is that we can do all this study, find all these things we find interesting, and just try to put them all into the sermon because we find all of them interesting. A good sermon is selective. Because the wider point is, if you have done this work properly, then really from one passage, you should be able to get a couple of sermons. You don't need to put it all into one thing. You should be able to get various different perspectives. You can take it from various different things you can say, various things that you can highlight that are all true to the text. But the main things that I really want you to get to understand today is, one, that every sermon should have a central idea, one main thing you were trying to communicate. And then two, you should be able to distill your message down to a single idea. And you should be able to state that idea. You should be able to state that idea. So, for example, I preached yesterday, we had a communion service at one of my churches. The idea of my sermon yesterday was basically that communion is a call for spirit-empowered service. Communion is a call for spirit-empowered service. Now, that's all I wanted to say. But the reason I preached is because that needs some explaining. People may ask the question, well, what does that mean? Is it true? What difference does that make to my life? And that's where the sermon comes in. But all I was trying to communicate yesterday was that communion is a call for spirit-empowered service. And then if you have that clarity with your sermons, I can guarantee you now, it is going to make your presentation better. Because too often, and I know you may have said it, but too often people go to worship, they listen to the sermons, and our standard is too low because people will come away saying, well, that was a good sermon because they made sense. Making sense is the lowest common denominator. We should not be preaching sermons, and people should not be preaching who don't make sense. That's not fair on the listeners, and on some level, I would go as far to say it's disrespectful to God. We need to make sure we are doing the work, that when we are communicating, we are clear. So really for today, this is what we are focusing on. It's really about getting into my mind and your mind, this idea about clarity, having your single idea, being able to distill it into a single sentence. And what I want to do really today, over the next couple of hours, is show you how to do that. So, moving forward, just some terminology which I may use because I've used various terms on it before, but just so you know. So SNDT, and when Dr. Turner comes back, this is probably the term that he'll use, and this was a term that they use at Newbold, but it stands for single narrow dominant thought. Homiletical thought is a term that I use partially because of a book I read, and that's the term that used, and then the big idea. All these three things mean the same thing. It's this idea that you should have a sentence or something which summarizes your sermon. So to go back to yesterday, my sentence, my single narrow dominant thought was, communion is a call to spirit-empowered service. My homiletical thought was, communion is a call to spirit-empowered service. My big idea was, communion is a call to spirit-empowered service. So there are various terms. I gave you the various terms because I realized that I may slip into using different ones. But if I do, I mean the same thing by all of them. It is the central idea of your sermon. So moving on very quickly. All ideas are made up of a subject and a complement. The subject is really, what am I talking about? The complement is, what am I saying about what I'm talking about? If you remember it from basic English, it's the idea of a subject and a predicate. So you've got your subject and you're saying something about your subject. And that's basically the idea. That's how you form any idea. So, for example, very basically, if I was to say, I am very tired today, the subject is me. The predicate or the complement is that I'm very tired. And then those two things come together. You know that I'm very tired. It's not that the Riley is tired or that Osvaldo isn't tired. It's that I'm tired. So the ideas are made up of a subject and a complement. What am I talking about and what am I saying about what I'm talking about? Now, what we're going to do now is just some exercises together, and then eventually I'm going to put you into breakout rooms and you can do some exercises by yourselves. But where I'm going to give you a couple of passages, and I want you to identify in the passage, what is the subject, what is being talked about, and then what is the complement, what is being said about what's being talking about. So the way I phrase subject and complement here is really for your sermons. So what am I talking about? What am I saying about what I'm talking about? But generally it's what's being talked about in this passage and what's being said about what's being talked about. Hopefully that all makes sense. So again, idea, 2 parts. Subject, what is being talked about? Complement, what is being said about what is being talked about. So I've got 3 or 4 of these just very simple paragraphs where I want you to identify for me what you think the subject is, and then what the complement is, and then what you do to form an idea is you put those 2 things together. So I'll read the passages, and then what I want people to do is tell me what they think the subject is and then what they think the complement is. And I don't really want to spend too long on this, so I'm going to take only 2 people, maybe on the subject and 2 people on the complement. So if you want to make your point, get your hand up quickly because we're going to go through 4. Then if there's any questions on this section at the end, we'll come back to it and clarify anything. So, one other thing on this that I forgot to say, questions to form the subject. So thinking about what I'm talking about, it's normally a what question, a who question, a when question, a why question, a where question, or a how question. So if you're thinking about what is being talked about and you form the subject as a question, it should really start with what, who, when, why, where, or how. I hope that makes sense. And now sometimes you can get multiple subjects. So this isn't hard and fast. This isn't a science, it's more of an art. So there may be different ways of phrasing the subject, which are saying the same thing. So you could say the same thing with a what and a why question, that they just have slightly different emphases. But in forming these questions, it's what, who, when, why, where, or how. Forming the question for the subject, and then the complement is really the answer to that question. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So, first text and passage. I'll read it, then I want to know the subject, what is being talked about, and you form that with a what, why, who, when, where, or how question, and a complement. So it's this. This one is quite topical. I found it yesterday. So it says this, but claims by his campaign team that he had reached the threshold of 100 MPs needed to secure a place in the first round of voting were met with skepticism by Mr. Sunak's supporters. They have challenged the Johnson camp to release the list of names, as the number of MPs who have gone on the record as backing the XPN is considerably smaller. Very small paragraph. It's obviously, yeah, well, no, I'm not going to tell you what it's about because you have to read it. So what is being taught? What's the subject of this small passage? Okay, Clive, Clive, and then Calvin, and then the rest you might have to answer on the complement. So Clive, go for it.
I would say the subject is Mr. Sunak, and the complement is his doubts that.
Okay, so only the subject, and form the subject as a question. So what is the question that this passage is answering?
About your replacement leader for the Conservative Party.
Okay, it is, but it's even more specific than that. Be more specific. So I'll take Sita. So be very specific. Think of what, how, who, when, where, why.
Oh,
It's
right.
about-
It's
about-
Rishi Sunak. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, Sita.
It's about the elections and
It is?
the holding of who's got how many seats and the legitimacy of it.
Yeah.
So the campaign and the legitimacy of it.
Okay.
And there's two contenders there.
But form it as a question. So I'll show you what I did, and this is the reason I wanted to spend so much time, because I want you to be even more specific. So my question for the subject was, why don't Sunak supporters believe Boris Johnson has reached the 100 threshold? That's what I would say the subject of this passage is. And that's how specific you would want to be when you're dealing with this. And the reason I would say that that's a subject is it talks about him reaching the threshold of 100 MPs needed to secure place in the first round of voting. But it also talks about how they were met with skepticism by Mr. Sunak's supporters. And then it says they have challenged the Johnson camp to release the list of names as the number of MPs to have gone on record as backing the ex-PM is considerably smaller. So although it's about the election and although it's about Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, it is specifically, the subject of this passage is, why don't Sunak supporters believe Boris Johnson has reached the 100 threshold? Because you have this idea of him reaching the threshold, you have this idea of skepticism, and then the rest of it is really about them challenging the Johnson camp to release a list of names because the number of MPs that have gone on the record as backing the MPs is considerably small. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so then if that is the subject, what's the complement? So what's the answer to this question? How does this passage answer the question? Mark.
I think it's a challenge of from the Sunak's camp asking the PM's camp to release the names of those 100 MPs who are supporting him.
Okay, yes, it is the challenge, but does that answer the question why they don't believe Boris Johnson has reached the 100 threshold? That says what they want him to do, but
Yeah,
what in this
I don't
passage
believe
tells
it,
us?
yeah.
So Malusi?
It's because Mr. Johnson's supporters have not provided evidence.
Yes, yeah, that's one way of saying it. Everton, can you say it even more clearly? Everton? Your hand is raised. Okay, Everton's not there. I'll take Sita.
So they want the evidence, don't they, of the names, and
Yes.
also it's about backing the ex-MP as well, which
Yeah,
is
the ex-PM.
the
Okay.
comparison.
Yeah. So what I had, just to make it even more clear. So the question is, why don't Sunak supporters believe Boris Johnson has reached the 100 threshold? And then, because the number of MPs to back Johnson publicly is much smaller. So that would be the answer. So this passage, if this passage is about why Sunak supporters don't believe that Boris Johnson has reached the 100 threshold, it's really that bottom bit which says the number of MPs to have gone on record as backing the ex-PM is considerably smaller. That's why they don't believe he reached the 100 threshold. So, subject and complement, putting the idea of this passage together, it will come out as Sunak supporters do not believe that Boris Johnson has reached the 100 threshold because the number of MPs to publicly back Johnson is much smaller. And all I've done is put the subject and the complement together. That's it. Does that make sense? And on that basis, that's another way of saying what the idea of the passage is. Now, because we're dealing with very small passages, the idea of the passage is almost the same length as the paragraph we William just read. But the idea is to do this with bigger passages. Yeah, so let me move forward. So text number 2. It says this: William Alexander was working as a baker in Edinburgh in the 1940s when he came up with the idea which was to transform his fortunes. After finishing his morning's work, he didn't want the machines to be redundant, so he started dropping finely sliced potato into the deep fat fryers which were normally used to make donuts. William started making big batches of crisps which he delivered all over the Scottish capital. The business took off rapidly, and by 1964, Golden Wonder was the biggest crisp company in the UK. So that's the passage. Take some time to read it. This passage is a little longer. Thinking about this passage, what is the subject of the passage? So is this passage answering a what question, a why question, a who question, a how question, a where question, or a when question? And sometimes it can be answering multiple. Oh, yeah, just on, yeah, Lorraine's point, just reading it now. Yes, we do have to make the distinction between the subject. So this is now the subject of a passage, not the, so the subject of the whole passage, not the subject in terms of character. So it's a different use of the word subject, but thank you, Lorraine, for pointing that out. So anybody who wants to go, what do you think the subject of this passage was? So I did get from Frederica how crisp was invented, but I want a sharper subject than that, because it says more than that and it's more specific. Clive.
How did crisps come into popularity?
Okay. How did crisp come into popularity? Lordina, I want it even sharper than this.
He said what I wanted to say, sorry.
Okay. Everton, I don't know why you can't unmute. You should be able to. But I'll have to ask Yvonne just to try and solve that problem. Arnold, was your hand up to answer this? Or was it up for something else?
Yeah, I can take this one out. I can take this one too.
Yeah.
I would take this subject as William Alexander. The question is, how did he transform his fortunes in the 1940s?
Okay, so yeah, I think that's a legitimate subject, and this is where you can sometimes find you have multiple subjects depending on what you focus on. So William Alexander, how did he transform his fortunes in the 1940s? That's not the subject I had, but it's one that I'll accept, and I'll show you what I had. How was Golden Wonder crisp started? So people did say how did crisp come to be invented, but it's not just crisp, it is Golden Wonder crisp that we're looking at. And again, this is why you need to be specific with what you're dealing with. But also, I think an acceptable subject is how did William Alexander transform his fortunes in the 1940s? And that's why sometimes you can have multiple subjects just depending on how you answer the question. But what you're trying to do with the subject is find a question that summarizes and makes sense of the majority of information in the passage. Yeah, so Everton, I don't know why you're not being allowed to unmute, but everyone, if you could try and sort that out so that Everton can unmute and be able to share with us. So everyone else.
Yeah, I can't unmute him. He will have to do it from his side. I can't do it. Yeah.
So Everton, maybe sign out and then come back in and then see if that makes a difference, because I don't know why you can't unmute. Okay, but carrying on. So how was Golden Wonder crisp started was a subject. If that's the subject, what's the complement? What's the answer to the question? Peter and then Becky.
The compliment was that he didn't want the machines to be redundant. And so he through trial and error, he dipped in the thinly sliced potatoes, which then were used for donuts. And that, of course, revolutionized the Golden Wonder crisps.
Okay, no, that's a good way of saying it, but it's too long. So what I want is something shorter and tighter, but no, thank you, because you covered it, but it needs to be tighter. Becky?
Thank you.
Yes, I was gonna say, because he started to dropping fine slice of potatoes into the deep fat fryers. That's it.
Okay. I'll be happy with that. I'm trying to work out what I had. It was started by William Alexander, who dropped finely sliced potatoes into a deep fat fryer.
Yeah.
So in terms of this passage, the idea is simply about what he did to start Golden Wonder Crisp. Now, Arnold talked about how did William Alexander change his fortunes. If you make that the subject, then the compliment is still pretty similar. He changed his fortunes by dropping finely sliced potatoes into a deep fat fryer. That's it. And hopefully that makes sense. So the idea, when it comes together, is Golden Wonder Crisps was started by William Alexander in Edinburgh, who dropped finely sliced potatoes into a deep fat fryer. Now, one thing that I want to clarify, just going back, just so you can see, although that's the idea, in this passage, you get a lot more information. So you get that it was after he finished his morning's work. And you get that he didn't want the machines to be redundant. And you get that the machines were normally used to make donuts. You also get that he was working as a baker in Edinburgh in the 1940s. You get that he delivered all over the Scottish capital, but that's not the main idea of the text. And this is what we're talking about. So I think in maybe his first session, Dr. Turner talked about it. If, for example, you were to preach this very small passage, it wouldn't be right to preach it and to use it as a sermon about baking. That's not the point of this passage. It's also not a sermon about why crisps are better than donuts. Like, although that information or there's information in there, and it's also not a passage about Edinburgh. That information is there, but it's not central to what the passage is saying. Like, and that's really what you're thinking about with the subject and complement. What needs to be there for the idea to make sense, and what's central to the passage. So there's stuff which is extraneous and around, but you have to deal with what's central. Mark.
Hi, can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Right. You were saying that this wouldn't be about baking. Would this then, if this was a sermon, be about innovation and his idea not to leave the machines redundant, about his innovation?
Yeah, you like could talk about it. Like, innovation is a legitimate topic to talk about, because the subject and complement is how was Golden Wonder Crisp started. It was started by William Alexander, who dropped finely sliced potatoes into a deep fat fryer. So what you've done there, and I didn't need to mention this, but I will, is what's called the ladder of an abstraction. So this idea, Golden Wonder Crisp, was started by William Alexander in Edinburgh, who dropped finely sliced potatoes into a deep fat fryer, is one level. If you take an upper level of an abstraction, you can get to innovation. That Golden Wonder Crisps came about by William Alexander's innovation. That's still legitimate and fair to the text. Okay, Everton, you don't need to be disappointed. You can be happy that that this process isn't working for you in your understanding. Yes, Garni, final comment, because I've still got others that I want to do.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so like when you're preaching, when do you drop this idea? Does it come as a conclusion, or as you go, then the idea you're sharing it?
So that's a really interesting thing. We'll talk about it probably more in the next section. But there is what is called inductive and deductive preaching. So very briefly, deductive preaching would be the idea comes at the very beginning and you say it first. So yesterday, I preached deductively because I read my scripture and then I basically said, what I want to say to you today, if you don't remember anything else, is that communion is a call to spirit-empowered service. But for those of you who have heard me preach, most of the time I will preach inductively. So you won't get my central idea until the end. Now, there are certain reasons for that and certain things I believe about preaching, which I think makes that a more helpful way to communicate or hold attention. But it's absolutely up to you. And that's a choice you make based on what you want to achieve with the message. So sometimes the same text will be preached inductively or deductively, but great question. And Barbara, I'm going to have to just leave that question now because I want to go on to my final one because there's still a lot of stuff we need to get through, but hopefully at the end we'll have some time for more questions. So third text, hopefully now people are getting it and understanding it. This one says, oops, let me move this down. Oops, no, I gave it away. In a complex, fast-paced world of sound bites, knee-jerk opinions, and information overload, BBC Future provides something different. A home for slowing down, delving deep, and shifting perspectives. We'll look for answers to the issues facing the world in science. You'll find stories here on almost every topic that matters: psychology, food, climate change, health, social trends, technology. What is the subject of this passage? So is this passage answering a what question, a how question, a why, a who, a when, or where? Sita.
So the BBC are providing questions on this platform on various topics that are affecting individuals.
Okay, so form it as a question, because like it's always useful to form the subject as a question. So what would the question be? Arnold.
Why are
How
the
does the BBC? Okay, carry on.
So I'll go to Arnold. Sorry, Sita. Arnold.
Yeah, how does the BBC help in our time today in the provision of yeah?
Okay, I think it may be even more specific than that. Clive?
How BBC Futures provides something different.
Okay, how does BBC Future provide something different? Yeah, actually, that's not what I had, but I do like that one because I think that one is legitimate, and it kind of like I said reminds us that you don't always have to form the question the same way. So what I had was, what is the purpose of BBC Future? But I would also say the question of how does BBC Future provide something different is also a legitimate question. It's the same thing in my mind as what is the purpose of BBC Future, just in different words. But if that is the subject, what's the complement?
The topics.
Okay.
The topics.
Okay, so is it the topic? Because I think other places talk about psychology, food, climate change, health, social trends, and technology. So is it the topics or is it more than that? Anybody else?
Current affairs. It's about current affairs, isn't it? That affecting the individuals.
But I want it even more specific. If we're answering the question, Lorraine.
What is the purpose of BBC Futures by delving deeper into the various topics listed?
Okay, yeah, that gets somewhere. I think we can still be more specific. Clive, I haven't heard from you, so I'm going to go to Prabhu, who I haven't heard from.
Yeah, I think you'll find stories here on almost every topic that matters.
Yes, that's incorrect, but there are other places you can find stories on those topics. Micho?
Slowing down to reflect.
Okay. Malusi?
Yes, similar to Mitchell, I was going to say it provides an opportunity to slow down and look at things deeply using science.
Okay. And Wael? Wael?
I would say it provides something different because they spoke about fine sound bites and knee-jerk opinions. But what BBC does is it provides us something different, then it goes on to explain what the difference is.
Okay. So that is, yeah, exactly right. So what's the purpose of BBC Future? To look for answers in the world of science, helping people slow down, delve deep, and shift perspective. That's what I said. So the topics they talk about is information, but it's not central to the purpose. because other places do that. What is central to the purpose of BBC Future is this idea that it's to slow down, to look for answers in the world of science, delve deeper, and shift perspective. Does that make sense? Osvaldo, I'm just going to mute you. Okay, so those are the examples. Let me just check what's next. Yep, so the purpose of BBC Future is to look for answers in the world of science, helping people slow down, delve deep, and shift, or delve deeper, sorry, and shift perspective. So, great. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, because we've talked about this, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. And we have worked out how to share screens into breakout rooms. So I'm going to share my screen into the room, and I'm going to give you about 20 minutes. How many have we got? So I'll create 10 breakout rooms. Yeah, so you're going to be in there for about 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes, I'm going to give you 4 texts on the screen. Your job for each text in your groups is to work out what the subject is and then what the complement is, and then put it together into the idea. 5 minutes on each text, and I hope this makes sense. We've not tried this putting screens into breakout rooms before, but I hope it's going to work. If we do have some issues with it, we'll try and get them fixed. So let me create the breakout rooms. Okay. So, yep, they look like they're all done. The rooms are open. So please join your breakout room. And then I will put into your breakout room. For those of you who are still here, please join your breakout rooms. Let's work out how to do this. Welcome back, everybody. So what I want to do, we're just going to go through these, and I want to hear at least from 2 groups for every single one, what you got as a subject and complement. So which group wants to go first with Philippians 1, 15 to 18?
Yes, I can go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think on our group we discussed as a subject how to proclaim Christ effectively.
Okay. Okay. How to proclaim Christ effectively, and then what was your complement for that subject?
Our complement, maybe Stan can help me with that one. I think we ran out of time, but I'm sure we're discussing about complement and then we'll run out of time. Stan, are you there to help on that one?
I would, if I could remember. 10 minutes ago was a long time ago, my friend.
I mean, I was hoping you had actually written these down, and I probably should have done that. So that was the intention. Okay, but Lorraine, your group, subject and complement on Philippians 1, 15 to 18.
Okay, so we deliberated a little bit, but I think in the end we concluded with, does it matter what you choose to proclaim about Christ? And the complement is, regardless of what you proclaim about Christ, Christ is proclaimed anyway.
Okay. Okay, so that's interesting. Like I like it, apart from we started with Doug. So if we would make that a what, how, who, why,
okay,
when, that would be even better. But I think you're on the right path. One last one. 5, if you weren't in the same group, what did your group do for subject and complement on Philippians 1:15 to 18?
Yeah, so we concluded, does it matter why we proclaim Christ as the subject, and the complement? It doesn't matter so long as we proclaim and rejoice in doing so.
Okay, so again, how do we change it from a does to a what, who, why, when, where? Or
We had a why in there. Does it matter why?
So a why at the beginning. So I went to as the beginning. So let's think. So a why question would be, and I guess to make it even more specific would be, why is Paul not upset about people's motivations in proclaiming Christ? I think that worked as a good subject, just thinking off the top of my head as a why. Sita, and then Frederica, and then we'll move on to the next one.
We had why do people proclaim Jesus, and then we came up with the complement was the different reasons.
Okay.
Different reasons as to why, because I thought that was important.
So that's interesting. But again, now this is about working out what is central information and what is subsidiary. So I would say the purpose of this passage isn't why people proclaim Jesus. It's really about Paul's view on it. So Paul says, so it's really verse 18 which has the purpose of the passage. It doesn't matter, just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. But I definitely take your point. Frederica as the last one, then we're going to move on because I want to get through all of these and then work on
There was another question where we asked, well, which group are you in?
Okay, so that's interesting, and that could be true, and that could be actually an application of the sermon. But in terms of the subject and complement, Paul isn't asking the question, which group are you in? Does that make sense? So when we're dealing with the text, so what you've done is you've moved from just the subject complement to an application, and that's a legitimate application, potentially if you're preaching the text of that sermon. But in terms of subject complement, that's not what Paul is asking, or what Paul is talking about. But no, thank you for that. Moving on to the next one.
Could you repeat the subject, please?
So I said off the top of my head, why is Paul not concerned about how people proclaim Christ as a subject? Not gonna take any more questions. Sorry. If we get some time at the end, we definitely will do. But I want to move on to the next text. So if you prepare for the next text, Psalms 15. Different groups. What was your subject and complement?
Right. For this one, we
Sorry, let me get that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I just
for this one, we thought it was asking. It starts by saying, "Who may abide in your tent or in your holy hill?" And it's not talking about a tent or a hill. So we thought it's talking about God's presence. Who can abide, remain in God's presence, or who can live in close fellowship with God?
Okay.
And we thought the answer was those who live a life pleasing to Him, or those who do His will. And we kind of summarized it. Those who remain close to God are those who do what is pleasing to Him.
Okay. You know what? On that, I think, Mark, that's the only answer I'm going to take. I am like that one, and I'll explain why. There we go. Why I like it, because this passage was a little bit easier for the subject because you get it right in that first verse. Who may abide in God's tent, or who may dwell on holy hill? Yes, you changed it to who may dwell in God's presence, and I like what you did there as well, because it's possible to fall into the trap of saying, technically the answer is everything else in the rest of the passage. But to go through that and say, those who are blameless and do right, those who speak the truth, those who don't slander with their, well done for summarizing it and putting it together. So the idea of Psalms 15 is the ones who may abide in God's presence are those who do His will, basically. So that one could have got a bit tricky, but well done to Mark for not falling into the trap and recognizing that sometimes, and in some passages, it will actually give you the subject. So it's very clear. You don't need to fight hard to find it. It's there. Okay, so next passage. These ones now we're moving into more narrative passages. Mark 3, 1 to 6. Anyone want to talk about what their subject and complement was, and then what their idea was for this passage, what their group's idea was? These ones start to get a little bit more difficult. So Sita.
So our group thought that the question was, is it good or unlawful to heal on the Sabbath? Because basically it was in the text.
Okay.
And then the second was, the complement was the fact that Jesus healed the man with the withered hand. So question was, is it good or unlawful to heal? Because the Pharisees were there, who were watching him, scrutinizing him to see, is he going to break the law? And then it's, you know, to do good for people. So that's what we came up with. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Ian?
We came up with accusing other people on this one, because the Pharisees were looking to accuse Jesus. We didn't quite get to the complementary bit.
Okay, so then if you were to phrase accusing other people as a question, how would you phrase it as a question? Because that's what I want you to do. Is it a what question, or why, a who, a how, a when, or a where?
So I think the question is a how. How can we trap Jesus?
Okay, that's an interesting one.
And then the accusation would come if he fell into the trap, as it were.
Yeah. So again, if you're gonna do that, make it more specifically, because the question of the text isn't how we can. The question is how the Pharisees or those against Jesus wanted to trap him. But no, moving in the right direction. Arnold?
We came up with our subject there. I said the subject is Jesus. I'm trying to lean also towards the law, but the question is, how did Jesus demonstrate how to do good on a Sabbath? One member even said that if this case was happening on a day that's not on the Sabbath, it wasn't going to be an issue. So the issue was actually the Sabbath. And the answer, agreeing with the first person who spoke, it says he healed the man with a shriveled or a withered hand on the Sabbath to demonstrate how to do good on the Sabbath.
Okay, so I like that. The only thing I would say is that in verse 2, you've got the Pharisees watching him, and in verse 6, you've got them going out and conspiring with the Herodians. I think that's important to the passage. So how do you include that? Because I think that also needs to be in there as well.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess, Frederica said, what is lawful activity on the Sabbath? This one's a bit more difficult because you've got a lot of moving parts. And I'm trying to think. So
in our group, we thought how the Herodians and Pharisees conspired against Jesus.
Yeah, so you could get how they did. It could also be why did the Herodians and Pharisees conspire against Jesus. I am trying to see. But then if you make Jesus the central thing of the passage, then it changes the question slightly. So as some have said, maybe something along the lines of, how did Jesus' observance of the Sabbath upset the Herodians and Pharisees? That could be one. Marva and Yesgani?
Could it be why did Jesus heal on the Sabbath?
Why did he heal on the Sabbath? Actually, yes, I think, why did Jesus heal? What would your compliment be to that if the question was, why did Jesus heal on the Sabbath?
I didn't finish writing it, and I don't have the passage in front of me, but it could be something around to show the hardness of their hearts, something around that.
Yeah, so I think the question, why did Jesus heal on the Sabbath, can work if you can include in the answer both the man and the Pharisees. And this is why this stuff isn't hard and fast. There isn't only one way to do it. You've just got to make sure that what you come up with is representative of your entire passage. Yes, Garni, final comment, then we'll move on to our last text.
Yeah, because earlier you mentioned that some texts can have two subjects. So I was thinking, could this be one of those where you're looking at how, unlawful it is to do good on Sabbath, and also you're looking at the plot. So I don't know how would you marry those two? Like if you were in this preaching, would you want to use both subjects and come up with two ideas?
No.
So
It may be just depending on the text. So this also comes into perspective, because in this text, you can focus on Jesus and his attitude to the Pharisees, or you can focus on the Pharisees and their attitude to Jesus. And technically what I would say from both of those, you can probably get two separate legitimate messages from them, but don't try and combine them necessarily. Like, I think you've almost got to pick one to put, so there's at least two potentially different sermons here. Or if you join it all together, one sermon with two major points, depending on which perspective you look at.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that's I think, Jacob, you make a very clear point. And you're going to find these with biblical texts, like depending on where you focus and what you focus on and what angle you come at it at. Sometimes there can be multiple ways of looking at it, but there are always things which are central and things which are peripheral. What I don't want you to do is to start to preach the periphery thing. So make sure that whatever you're doing, that it covers the whole text, not just part of the text. Final one, 1 Kings 3, 5-9. This one was the longest passage I gave you just because I was trying to increase the difficulty as we went on. Anybody on this passage? What was the subject complement idea that came out of this passage? Clive.
We decided on what Solomon desired of God as a subject, and or what did Solomon desire of God as a subject, and the complement, wisdom and understanding to govern the people of Israel and discern between good and evil.
Okay. I like what. I guess my question would be, is why a better question? But that's just something to think about. Lorraine?
So we went for the why question. Why did Solomon ask for wisdom? Because it was quite obvious what he asked for.
Yeah.
So we went for the why question.
Okay.
And then the compliment is because he felt he was a child. But to kind of summarizing it all together, we put Solomon asked for wisdom because he felt he was only a child and didn't have what it was needed to rule a great nation.
Okay. Yeah. That works. Anyone else on that passage?
Yes, our group came with actually two subjects, but I'm going to mention one now. He said, "What shall I provide for you?" And obviously Solomon saw the need of wisdom. That's why he asked for wisdom, so that he can able to govern.
Okay. So when you have your question as what should I provide? More specific, who is the what? Who is the you? Make sure you get all that information in. Again, Des and Arnold, I will take your comments later because technically we do need to finish about 1. Now I want to work, just due to time, I want to work on, in fact, sorry, this statement, and then I want to work on something else. So questions which will help, especially for biblical stories, because biblical stories are a bit different, and to help you to work out what the subject is and what the complement is and really what the story is about. So these are just some questions which can really be helpful. Firstly, who were the characters in the story and why did the author include them? Secondly, do the characters contrast with one another? Thirdly, how do the characters develop as the story develops? Fourthly, what does the setting contribute to the story? Fifthly, what structures hold the story and provides its unity? Sixth, how do the individual episodes fit in the total framework? 7, what conflicts develop and how are they resolved? 8, what ideas lie behind the story that may be implied but not stated? And then finally 9, oops, I can see it. can those ideas be stated to a subject complement? Now, these aren't questions you have to ask, but they are questions which can definitely be helpful when you're dealing with biblical stories to bring them together. And to really, and some of these questions you will have generally answered implicitly in the work you've done previously. Now, some of them you may not have answered implicitly, but it's important that you bring all these things together. So we have just over 20 minutes left. And we've really got two options. Either we can spend some time going back over Matthew 5, 1 to 20 and working out what the subject complement is together. If we choose not to do that, I just want to check, are there still lots of questions or points of clarification that people need to make? If there are, we can just do questions now. If not, we'll go ahead and do Matthew 5, 1.
I just wanted to ask on the actual, depending on what focal point, for example, the one with Solomon, we are looking at it from Solomon's perspective, but what about from God's perspective? Because he's the one who approaches Solomon, and then everything builds up from God approaching Solomon.
Yes.
So is there anything that we can somehow see from God's perspective in terms of building the subject and then the complement?
I would say no. So what you have to do with each text is work out what perspective it is being told from. But one thing which I was going to talk about next session, but I can mention now, what can also help you with the subject and complement. What did I put it in? Yes, I did. This. So every text, and thank you, Des, for your question, has a vision of God. So God plays some kind of role in the text. Maybe he's judge, maybe he's king, maybe he's ruler, maybe he's merciful. And the question for every passage, even though it may not be from God, what kind of vision of God does this passage give? And then secondly, how should people, thinking about humans now, how should people in this passage have responded to the vision of God, and how did they respond? These things will also help in terms of working out what the subject complement is. So when you talk about God's perspective, every text has a vision of God, and it presents some kind of attribute or character of God, or God appears a certain way in this text. That's important to identify, but that may not be the focus of the passage, if you get what I mean. Any other questions on anything before we move forward? Okay. It seems if there are no other questions, then what we will do.
John, could you kindly just go back to the previous, the other one, please? Just wanted to see the last question. Yes.
Yeah. So don't forget, you're going to get all these. You're going to get the PowerPoint for yourself, so you don't need to be copying or writing anything down.
I just wanted to start working on them, really.
Okay.
Using them. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. No problem.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so what we're going to do then for the last 20 minutes is we're going to work on Mark 5, 1 to 20 together. Just because it's so long, I didn't put the passage up as a text, so you're going to have to use your Bible so that you can see it. But really together, we're going to work out what is Mark 5, 1 to 20 talking about. And then on that basis, once you've answered that question, we'll look at answering the question, what is Mark 5, 1 to 20 saying about what it's talking about? So you've already done a lot of work on Mark 5, 1 to 20. What do you think the subject of the passage is?
Teacher, sorry, you said Matthew chapter 5.
I meant Mark 5.
Okay,
Mark 5, so the passage you've done on the Gerasene Demonia.
Okay.
Apologies. So Mark 5, 1 to 20. What is the subject? What is Mark 5, 1 to 20 talking about? Elder Riley.
For me, I think it's referencing or speaking to the fact that how Jesus healed the demoniac or the demon-possessed man.
Okay, so how Jesus healed the demon-possessed man? Yeah, I think that's a fair subject. I guess my question is, does it encompass the whole text? Because
No, it doesn't.
so we're there now. This is a really interesting thing. Working out subjects and complements is really hard because you have to spend the time working out which one encompasses the like whole text. So how is a good starting point, but I think we've got to go beyond that. Clive.
I like the summary that Sister White uses for this in Ministry of Healing, which is saved to serve.
Okay, that's good, but I want it as a subject. So if you're forming it as a question, what would the question be? And Barbara?
I would say, do demons know God?
Okay, again, what, how, when, how, what, when, how, why, where, who is a better subject rather than do. And again, even with do demons know God, does that cover the whole passage? So I want something that covers the whole passage. Calvin.
So yes, what is your response to Jesus' action to healing a demonic man, devil-possessed man?
Okay, so what is the response to Jesus' action of healing a demon-possessed man? I think that covers it. I guess my only thing would be, have you done too much in the subject? Because you've already given. So this passage isn't just about his response, it's also about the healing too. So maybe you'd have to pull it back a little bit, but I like the direction we're going. Arnold?
How did Jesus demonstrate his power over demons in the region of the Gerasenes?
Okay. How did Jesus demonstrate his power over demons in the region of the Gerasenes? Yep, that works. Again, does it cover the end of the passage though? So what would your answer to that question be, Arnold?
He drove out the evil spirit from the man.
Okay.
And instructed him to go out to go back to his city instead.
Okay, so he did, but that second part doesn't have anything to do with your question of how Jesus showed his power over demons. So again, the question's good and we're getting there. And don't worry that it's difficult because this stuff is difficult. So Micho.
How the demoniac became a preacher of the gospel.
Okay. How did the demoniac become a preacher of the gospel?
Okay.
Do we feel that that is one which covers the whole passage?
Yeah, I think so. I think that covers it.
Yeah? Or how did the demoniac become a witness to Jesus? I think that one is one that covers the whole passage.
Yeah,
So,
it covers the whole
Micho,
thing.
what would be your answer to that? Miko, sorry.
He approached Jesus.
Okay, so technically that covers it, but I want something more specific. So he approached Jesus is true, but it's more specific. Sita.
I was thinking, how was Jesus perceived by the healing of the demonic man? Because then that brings in the perception of what people thought about him, be it negative or positive.
Okay, well, that works. Sorry, so I've got some hands up which have been up before. If you're making another comment, then keep your hands up. If your hand has just been left up, then please take it down. So, okay, so hands have changed. Marva?
I was more thinking of how did Jesus heal the demoniac, and the compliment would bring in that he spoke, he showed the power of his word, he spoke, and the demons left him because they had recognized who Jesus is. So it's showing the power of Jesus speaking, you know, the command that he gave for them to leave. So I haven't fully formed the complement, but that's my thinking.
How did he heal?
How did Jesus heal the demoniac?
So that's true, but again, I don't think it covers the whole passage. It only covers a section, and what we're trying to cover is the whole passage. Becky?
Yes, I thought we found the subject for what our sister said, you know, how did the demonic become a preacher? You know, so I thought we agreed that is the subject. So we're trying to find a complement. And my compliment is obviously he approached Jesus and he was cleansed from demonic and he was given power to go and preach to his people or to his community or something.
Okay, so that's a long compliment, but it could work. Yes, you're right. We have found it. I just wanted to like see if there was any other ways that we could go around the passage that would cover the subject as well. So Malusi, and then just Malusi, and then I'll share with you one that I thought about just based on our discussion.
Yeah, I'd already put my thought about the subject in the chat, but that's the same one. In terms of the compliment, I think I would have said he healed him and then instructed him to go and preach to his friends and family.
Okay, yeah. So one of the subjects which I thought, and I'm trying to work out whether I think it's too general now, but something which can work for this passage would be something along the lines, if you want to make it a what question, what happened when Jesus encountered the demoniac of the Gerasene? Because this passage deals with what happened when Jesus encountered the demoniac of the Gerasene. And then you can talk about he healed him and I guess encouraged him to tell people about it. So that can also work as a subject and then as a complement if you're using a what question. Mark?
I would like to look at the other side of the story where the people in the region come to Jesus and they flee from Jesus, go to the city, and then when the people of the city come to Jesus and beg him to leave the area. So I would like to build my compliments around that. Am I allowed to do that?
So that's part of the story. So I'm trying to think. Yes and no. Like
but
that can
comes
be
from
part of the
story.
sermon. Yeah.
That comes from what Jesus did. You understand it? That's and that
Yes.
makes
But
so can I build a compliment around that?
yeah, okay. So not centrally around that, I would say, because what you've got to ask when you're thinking about what's your compliment, what's the most important part? So is their reaction to Jesus more important than his confrontation with the demoniac? I would say no. So you can't make the story fully about that. It's partially about that. And that's why something like what happened when Jesus comes into contact with the demoniac may be a better, or how did the demoniac become a witness to Jesus, maybe even an even better way, because it includes what you want to talk about in terms of the reaction of the people.
All right, thank you very much. All right, thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Becky and then Des.
Sorry, my hand was up for.
Okay, no problem. Des.
Thank you, Pastor. Is it possible? Is it possible to formulate the subject without the why, when, how, even though you're thinking about it? So I had the day when the demoniac met Jesus.
Yes.
I haven't put the where.
Yeah. So yes, it is, but it's not the best way to do it because it's better to do it as a question because then it makes it easier to form the compliment. So
right.
Yes, the day when the demoniac met Jesus is a subject, but what's the complement to that? That's a harder phrase to form a compliment with. So it's better to even take the day the demoniac met Jesus. How do you form that into a question? Does that make sense?
Right. Okay, I'm with you.
Okay. Okay. So I think on that it is 12:51. We have worked hard today. I just want to take any other questions or comments that people may have. What I'm going to do is give you Genesis 20 for you to work out what your subject and complement is for that passage. Good luck with that. That one's going to be a bit harder, but you'll get all that from Yvonne later. But were there any other questions or anything which didn't make sense or anything you wanted clarifying based on what we've done today?
Yes, I've got a question, Pastor. Yeah, you know, going through this, you've given us lots of obviously lots of things to think about, which are very good. But is there any easy blueprint that we can able to follow? That as we are trying to, you know, to create some sermons, it can be easy for us to follow and to be on track rather than to be off track.
That's a great question. So let me see if I can find it. So everything I've given you today has come from a couple of books. And so yeah, let me just share my screen again. So this isn't a book by an Adventist, but it is still very useful in terms of forming sermons. And this goes through step by step. It's a book called Biblical Preaching, the Development and Delivery of Expository Messages. And this is the book which talks about the idea of the homiletical thought. It has some other steps, but if you wanted something to kind of guide you through step by step in forming sermons, I would recommend this book. For my own preaching, I still use this book, but like I still use the method of this book with some adjustments. But it is a great primer for step-by-step preaching. So it's called Biblical Preaching, and it's by Haddon Robinson. Some of you may have it already, but for me, in terms of going from nothing to a sermon, this I think is probably one of the best books out there. But no, thank you for that question. So it's called Biblical Preaching, and it's by Haddon Robinson, and it's the 3rd edition. There is a British edition called Expository Preaching, but if you buy it as Biblical Preaching, that would be fine. So that's what I would recommend in terms of helping you go step by step. It has some more stuff which I haven't discussed, but it's really 10 steps from the beginning from like having nothing in your text all the way through to the sermon. Some of the stuff we've done about exegesis, it doesn't talk about directly, but a lot of the stuff about subject complement, that comes from this book. So I appreciate the question, Becky.
Thank you, Pastor.
Any other questions? Yep, Alvin?
So yes, Pastor Alvin, it's obviously this material sharing with us is very good, and it's intended for preaching, but I see, you know, a bit of a crossover in maybe when you're not in the pulpit, using some of it in the Sabbath school to share with members while Sabbath school's been taught, and so see good reasons as to why, you know, we need to share some of it within Sabbath school or the teaching as well.
No, I would totally agree. So yes, Edom is for preaching, but really what preaching is at its basis is basically your Bible study packaged in a way that you're communicating it to other people. So a lot of this stuff is also just generally good Bible study principles for Sabbath school, reading the text closely, making so it works for preaching, but it also works in other areas when you're engaging with the Bible. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, and where can we buy the book?
Oh, the Biblical Preaching book. So it's anywhere. Amazon, Book Depository. That one I showed you was on Eden. But yeah, if you put in the title, there will be loads of places that book is available online.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, again, I hope there are no other questions or comments because it's all made sense and not because you've gone away more confused. Elder Riley.
Certainly, I've been made more aware, and I got a better understanding of how to formulate sermons. But as far as supportive I'm going to say documents, but as far as finding supporting information for your presentations, what books, or if any, do you allude to?
Oh, so okay. So there you're talking more about commentaries and Bible dictionaries, and I think what myself and Dr. Turner will do we'll make that a part of the next session as well, because we said that we would share that with you. But that, yeah, that's
Okay.
important. You're looking at biblical commentaries, so the SJ Bible commentary, there are other commentaries that you can get, Bible dictionaries, which will give you background and stuff. Ellen White, I think we'll probably have to have a little talk about in the next session. Ellen White is good. The only problem with Ellen White is once you read her on a passage, you stop thinking for yourself. And it's working out how to balance that, because there is also this idea in the Bible that we have a responsibility to like think for ourselves. And Ellen White was writing into a context. Our context now is slightly different. So you use her, but you've got to use her wisely. So what I would recommend when it comes to Ellen White, the worst thing you can do is think I'm preaching on this passage. Let me go see what Ellen White says about it straight away.
Verbatim.
Yeah, because then you're not gonna, so you need to like spend the time with you, the Holy Spirit, and the text first, and then go to Ellen White later. So that would be so Ellen White also, but don't go to her straight away.
Okay.
Otherwise you won't think for yourself.
Okay.
Osvaldo. Don't worry, Osvaldo, we can wait for you to unmute. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, is there anything in place or intended? Sorry.
Yeah.
To have, or all the preachers to have a background about theology.
Just ask that question again.
Hello.
Yeah,
can
we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. I just a bit interested about theology, to have a background instead, because we are preaching and we need to have a background about theology, about our church.
About the Adventist church theology, or about just generally theology? Because part of it comes from Bible study, and part of it comes from dedicating yourself to Bible study and actually spending time in the Word, proper time in the Word. So, and I'll say this, and I'll say it very advisedly. As an example, the Sabbath school lesson is good, but if you have been in the church, I would say for over 5 years, you're probably realizing that the Sabbath school lesson isn't having the same spiritual effect it was having 5 years ago. And what you have to begin to do is supplement it and spend more time of your own in the Bible. One of the best recommendations I've ever had in terms of Bible reading is that a lot of the time what we can do is wake up in the morning, we may randomly pick a text. Make your Bible reading systematic, like that will help. So let's say, I don't know, you decide for November you're going to read the Gospel of John. And what you do is you read a chapter every single day. You begin at chapter 1, the next day you do chapter 2. Like doing something like that systematically will exponentially increase your knowledge, and you'll also be reading these books as they're meant to be read. So in terms of theology, you have to begin to work on it yourself, and really think about how you can also grow. Because yeah, if you're doing the same thing you were 20 years ago, there probably needs to be some changes. Marva?
Yes, recognizing that there are different kind of learners in the group, the large group. I'm wondering if it's possible for us to do like a presentation, like, to see where we need developing. Like a part of this session could be like we have to present for 10 minutes on, as we develop a sermon and preach it for 10 minutes on here.
So we're going to have to work that out. I think maybe in the next 2 weeks, we'll begin to talk about homework and how we're going to do this. 10 minutes with 52 people is a long time. So we may not be able to like do it that way, but I think between myself and Dr. Turner, we'll work something out of what we can do. But definitely, it can't just be one way of giving the information, and we'll think about that. Elder Riley, I think that's the last question, and then we'll finish.
Regarding what you were speaking about to Osvaldo earlier, I thoroughly agree. And I maintain that the best teacher is the Holy Spirit. While you can gain ideas from other people and men, the best teacher is the Holy Spirit. So yes, get into the Word.
Yeah. It is really important to get into the Word. What I would say generally, just thinking about what I've been thinking about recently, especially I guess for most of you as church leaders and thinking about it, we need to do a better job of engaging our members in more than just Sabbath. And recognizing that, as if Elder Riley says, the Holy Spirit is the best teacher, the Holy Spirit has also given the church gifts. And it's about working out how we help. So if you look at Ephesians 4, for example, or 1 Corinthians 12, the idea you get is that the purpose of the church is to help everybody grow into what they're meant to be in Christ. And we're probably not doing that as effectively as we could be. And so maybe as leadership, we've got to begin to recognize people's gifts and recognize how we are meant to help and support each other in our growth through the Holy Spirit. So it's 3 minutes past 1. We are done for today again. I hope it all made sense. The next session should be myself and, well, the next 2 sessions should be myself and Dr. Benedict together. We'll give you any updates if anything on that changes. But thank you for coming. You'll get the notes and you'll also get your homework sometime this week. Let me just pray to close. Dear Lord, I just want to thank you for this time we've been able to spend on thinking and talking about your word. I just want to thank you for the dedication and the willingness of all these people just to come and spend these hours working out how to better communicate your word. I pray that you will be over everything we have discussed and said, and that everything will be done according to your word. And through this, we will be better expositors and better preachers and better communicators of your goodness and truth. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you
Thank
very
you very
much.
much, everybody.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Have a good
Bye.
week.
Holden.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Thanks,
for a
everyone.
brilliant.
Bye. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Pastor Holder,
Yes.
I didn't want to encumber others with my question, but I did ask this of Sister